again. I always forget this. Really apologize.
Got it.
So again, the floor is yours, Judy, please.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for inviting me here today. The question I want to address today is, does the way we do economics manifest our values? Our values could be our ethical values, the way we look at the world. And by we here, I'm going to talk about mainstream economics, roughly, neoclassical plus the different extensions that have been added on. And it seems to me there's a couple of common views within the profession. The first, that's probably the most common, is no, it doesn't. Economics is value-free. Because we use math and statistics that give you a clear answer, it is free of subjective biases and evaluations. Nothing about values in here at all. People who are a little bit more sophisticated will say, oh, well, actually, there are some epistemic values. We do want to do science. We do want to get objective knowledge. We do want to get to some kind of incontrovertible truth that everyone can accept. So in that sense, there are some values. But my talk today is going to be about why I think our values are very much in the way we do economics. And not only are they very much in the way we do economics, they're not doing us as a profession or really as a human race much good. So now I'm going to try to share my screen. Is that working? Okay.
Yes, perfect.
So economics by and for humans, because I'm going to argue that the way we do economics in the mainstream is actually very biased and does not create, certainly doesn't create objectivity and doesn't even create knowledge that we can rely on in any sort of way. Because it's created by humans and humans can't help but bring their values, their biases, their social conditioning, everything else to what they do. The second point is I don't think economics is doing a very good job currently for humans. It is not helping us preserve life. It is not helping us deal with crises on our planet, with climate change, anything else. So how could this be? Well, why am I arguing this, first of all, and then how could it be corrected? Because I think there are ways of correcting it. So first, just to get a sort of definition down, let's talk about the foundations of mainstream economics. I was educated in this. I went to University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I got my PhD. My first publication was in Econometrica. I've also published in Journal of Political Economy, American Economic Review, Journal of Labor Economics, a bunch of very mainstream places. So it's not that I don't know what mainstream economists do. I kind of consider my work in graduate school and in economics departments to be a participant observation study of the economics profession. And this is what I think I would generally get as answers to these three questions. What is economics? Some people would talk about it as the study of markets, business, commerce. Others might focus on the Lionel Robin sort of definition, focusing on rational choice in the face of scarcity. What do we want to get from good methodology? We want to get objectivity, truth, certainty. We want to be a science. We want to get the real stuff. So what characterizes good methodology? Mathematical formalism, logic, quantitative analysis, methodological individualism, all of these things that we have adopted. Those all sound nice and hard and scientific. Furthermore, we can contrast or look at when we mean rational choice, we mean not only rational, but self-interested and individual. We have this methodological individualized. So our definition focuses around these items on the left. Our methodology focuses on the items on the right. And we tend to drift into thinking that this gives us positive, non-normative, ethics-free, value-free sort of knowledge. Because after all, when you're doing a mathematical proof, it either works or it doesn't work. There isn't any perhaps value in getting from the first line to the last line, other than the epistemic one of not cheating. But this definition that sounds to us so scientific and, is often defended as being rigorous, et cetera, didn't just fall down from heaven. It was created by human communities at particular times. So I'm going to take you through a very brief history of neoclassical or mainstream economics. Some of you could fill in the details on this much better, but I just want to highlight a few points that I think were very important in creating the sort of value system we have behind economics these days. So we'd start out with Adam Smith, 1776, Wealth of Nations. A lot of the things that people know from Smith, Invisible Hand, et cetera, are not exactly what I want to focus on, because one of the other things he did that's less quoted about was use the metaphor of a machine to describe economies. This was probably because he was writing at the time of the Industrial Revolution. Machinery was just coming online. Machinery is very exciting. People were, really big into physics and, what affects what. So fascinated with machineries, factories, the rest. So he used that as a metaphor. Pretty common to use whatever's, in the popular mind. He wrote, for example, power and riches are enormous and operose machines. The word operose seems to have gone out of the English language. I could never find a definition for it, but presumably has something to do with operating, are enormous and operose machines. He also writes, the wheels of the wheels of the political machine can be made to move in harmony when one attends to the connections and dependencies of its several parts. So I have a picture of some gears and wheels, and so this is the metaphor he's bringing out here. Political economic, it was political economy at the time, so it was this that he's likening to a machine. Now, of course, Smith didn't just believe in that. He also wrote Theory of Moral Sentiments. He was very concerned with moral philosophy, concerned with business people getting together and colluding, and there's a lot more in Smith. But the key point I want to take from it for my story is about this mechanical metaphor that he started with. A second one would be the, jumping forward to John Stuart Mill in 1936. John Stuart Mill is another interesting character. He was actually quite a feminist for his time, wrote a lot of good and very interesting things. But there's a particularly essay of his that has been cited as the source of the idea of economic man, Homo economicus, his essay on the definition of political economy. And this one, I think, maybe he might have been better if he hadn't written, but it was very appealing and bought into the same kind of mechanical metaphor idea. He said that for political economy to be a science, it was going to have to narrow down its focus. He took as his model of science geometry and said that political economy must necessarily reason from assumptions, not from facts. So he didn't start out by observing how people actually act in economic life. That would be starting from the empirical side and drawing theory from that. He started from the theory side, saying we have to be like geometry, we have to have theorem proof, so we need some assumptions to start with in order to be able to do science defined as geometry. So he had to get to some kind of minimal set of starting principles from which you could derive results. And to do this, he took science and he divided off physical science. So we'll let everything having to go with bodies go to physical science. We'll divide off ethics. Everything having to do with ethics can go to philosophy. Social economy being how we deal with each other. We now say that that goes over to sociology. And then what he called political economy, which we now just call economics. Having gotten rid of bodies, values, and our interactions with each other, he says it's left with, quote, man, he uses that word, solely as a being who desires to possess wealth and who is capable of judging the comparative efficacy of means for obtaining that end. So there we have Homo economicus, economic man, this individual who's going to try to maximize something and is rational enough to be able to make the choices that will get them to that highest wealth. Now, Mill, again, being a more reasonable person, concludes that essay by arguing that no economist would ever, quote, be so absurd as to suppose that humankind is actually described by Homo economicus, and any sort of applications to the real world would need to be strengthened and informed and complemented by physical science, ethics, social economy. Economists seem to have forgotten that part, and economics has developed as though it is a complete science of human behavior, at least in the commercial realm. One more jump forward in thought by the late, oh, I got 1936 there. Sorry about that. Obviously, that's 1836 in that slide. I think I had it right in the former slide. Oh, no, got it. But this was an old, I remember this coming up when I used this before. Sorry, this was not the corrected slides. Anyway, 1836. But then by the late 1800s, the marginalist revolution, really the birth of neoclassical economics, we've got Walras-Pareto and all those folks up there in the corner, realized that you could take this notion of a mechanical economy and people as rational maximizing machines and put it into calculus. Whoa, now we can really feel like scientists, okay? We can say that a firm is in essence a profit maximizer. It looks at its revenue function and its cost function, it finds the highest point, and now we can use calculus to analyze this thing that we've called the economy. But what I want to argue is that this is an exceedingly narrow and binding and distorted idea of how people act in their economic life. We've kind of figured out, behavioral economics is, people maybe are not the rational calculators. Are people really so free from ethics? Are people really so free from social influence? I mean, can we talk about consumption without talking about advertising and social pressure? Can we talk about stock market panics without talking about emotions and these other things that have been completely left out of this mechanical model? So the suspicion that something might be kind of missing, and I started on this track because it was pretty clear that women and homes and families were completely missing, got me looking back at this history and realizing that it involves a mental compartmentalization. It takes part of life and calls this economy worthy of study and methods, to use and study. And it takes another whole part of human life and says, not economics, not worthy of study. Ignore this, ignore the man behind the person behind the curtain. We're not going to look at this part. And the methods, the valid methods that are also, we haven't included in our calculus analysis of this economy that we think of, that's also out there somewhere. And this does have a gender component to it. So what I call cognitive gender is the way, there's actually a good deal of psychology literature on this, the way our brains actually use gender as a cognitive organizer. And this happens whether you're male, female, non-binary, trans, whatever. We just have a whole lot of information coming in and we need to sort it out. We look at plants and we think poisonous, non-poisonous, pretty good for our survival. And we find other kinds of shortcuts. It turns out, as these psychology studies show, that gender is something we use as a cognitive organizer. For example, cats and dogs. If I could see you all, I'd ask you to raise your hands if you have gender associations with cats and dogs. And most people do. In Western culture, cats somehow seem more feminine, dogs more masculine. There's male and female cats. There's male and female cat owners, similarly for dogs. So this doesn't exist out there in the world anywhere, but it's a cognitive association we have, even if we're a male owner of a female dog or a female, whatever. These things get mixed up in reality, but we still have this association. Pink and blue, we have connotations in some cultural things about that. So now if we think about cognitive gender and we think about what was chosen in the economics profession to choose as subject and methodology, let's look at what's left out. So economics, the part we chose, markets, mental choice, individuality, self-interest, reason. Not economics, social life and families, bodily experience, relatedness, other interest, emotion. Are there gender connotations to these? There most certainly are. Through much of history, mythology, storytelling, social life, culture, family structure, everything else, the left-hand side here tends to be associated with masculinity, the right-hand side with femininity. So were people back at the time of creating science and economics really interested in creating good science or creating masculine science? Let's see. What about methodology? Quantitative, formal, positive, objective, general. I've also added in control here as another one. People often look to economists to try to control and predict things. Not economics, qualitative, verbal or intuitive, normative, subjective, particular. The unexpected. Fortuna is a female figure in Greek iconography. Those things are all not in our field. And this, I started out getting in this into economics using some philosophers from particularly writing in the 1980s or so, that noticed that back in the creation of science, these are all philosophers and historians of science, Evelyn Fox Keller, Sandra Harding, Susan Bordeaux, also Helen Longino. There's a much longer list I could put up here. Took a look at the history and philosophy of science and realized that instead of choosing to do good science, instead of choosing to try to find the best knowledge about what's going on in the world, all of these choices were made on the idea that whatever is masculine is superior and whatever is feminine can be ignored or is inferior. Now, how can that barrier be broken? I mean, if you look at these kinds of charts, one sort of thought might be, well, we can keep economics pretty much as it is, but every so often we'll have to also look at emotion, how emotion screws up rational decision making, something like that. We could bring in little bits, or we could look at markets and we could do some qualitative studies as well as quantitative, something like that. Choose a little bit from each side. Some people also think we should maybe flip this. After all, haven't men in markets driven us into stages of increasing inequality and destruction of the environment? Shouldn't we flip over completely into relatedness, cooperation instead of competition? Isn't mathematical analysis evil? Shouldn't we entirely do verbal? That's another extreme position. And another one, I have to say, and none of these are the ones I'm going to take. Another one is to say, well, male economists can do the left-hand side, and female economists, I'm glad somebody was unmuted there enough to laugh but I do hear this, and female economists, who aren't as good as math anyway, right, can do the qualitative analysis and the family analysis. And that's silly. Men also were born into families. They are not, immune to families. And women can do the math very well. Thank you very much. So what I look at is that all of those approaches are like trying to play a game of cards with a bunch of the cards missing. Okay, if you think you can just do mainstream economics as it is, you're playing with half a deck. You're only playing with looking at half of human behavior that has economic repercussions and only using half of the possible methods that could be useful. Or if you're trying to switch around, maybe using a little bit more than half the deck, but you're still not using the full deck. So what would it mean to be playing with a full deck? And here I invented a little diagram. Oops, where did I? Oh, first I wanted to say, I think there's a redefinition of economics that has to go on. I think people on the street don't think that economists or would not feel like paying for economists' salaries if they knew they were just lost in theories of rational choice. People on the street actually think that economists should have something to do with how the economy works, which is how they get their livelihood, and how they can spend what they have on the things that they need and want. If we're going to be worth our salaries, I think we need to pay attention to this. And so then economics really should not be defined by a method or some particular sphere of behavior, but should be the study of the ways that economies organize themselves to provide for the survival and flourishing of life. Survival brings in the bodily needs. Flourishing means there's also room for agency, creativity. This isn't just a accounting kind of problem. And it's about societies organizing themselves. Economies don't just, free markets don't just spring up on their own, as was found out after the USSR dissolved and things did not just turn perfect. So societies have to consciously organize these kinds of things, and we need to do it together as a group. It's not just all about individuals. What do we want to get from good methodology? Most people who have a little sophistication in philosophy of science realize that we have no view from nowhere. There's no planet out there we can view human behavior from. We're always viewing human behavior from inside human bodies and human minds. So absolute, incontrovertible truth that will stand forever isn't really even a goal of, fields like physics or chemistry. The frontiers of real science are always growing. We're always finding new things, finding ways in which maybe past theories were good enough for explaining the physics of billiard balls, but it doesn't apply to quantum, phenomena or something. So we never get to the final truth. We can, however, have a goal of finding knowledge that's reliable. That is, for the present situation, for the present questions we're asking, are we getting that sort of, narrower and more conditional truth? And if we've defined economics about survival and flourishing, then those methods should help us get to supporting those more. And what characterizes good methodology? Contrary to popular belief among economists, mathematics does not give us objectivity. At the most, it gives us consistency. If we start with a theorem, and we go through a proof, we do it right, we'll have consistency from top to bottom. Does that theorem have anything to do with human behavior in the real world? Maybe yes, maybe not. We have no idea. If we want our economics to touch down in the real world and help actually support human survival and flourishing, then we have to go beyond the math. The math can be helpful in making sure we're consistent, but it doesn't give us anything more than that. And good methodology, I will argue, and hopefully, if I don't go over time, also demonstrate in at least one case, requires careful inquiry. It's a systematic seeking of knowledge. It's not just off the top of your head. Openness to new evidence. Again, it's a dead dogma if it's not open to new evidence. And I think economics is quite a dead field if it just stays playing with half the deck. It's not working with everything. And Sina and I were talking about this a little bit before. Evaluation by larger communities. This doesn't just mean democratic vote by the whole country, but people who have some background and some knowledge, but different sorts of cultural and social backgrounds in particular, or socioeconomic backgrounds. Those voices need to be brought into scientific communities to make sure that people who have more power aren't blinded by their own power to their own biases. And again, I hope to demonstrate one of those at least briefly for you here later on. I put together some diagrams, which I don't want to spend a lot of time on. Oops, why am I now not able to advance my slide? There we go. So I just showed earlier that positive, masculine, feminine, negative idea that we're used to, that really informs a lot of our thought. This is just a little tool I put together called Gender Value Compass for breaking apart some of that thinking. In a lot of sort of Western liberal economic and political thought, you have individuals. These are the agents, the citizens. What about the women and children? Those are ignored. Those are just kind of dissolved. I mean, we have this idea of head of household. The head of household represents the entire household. Soluble, you put salt in water and it dissolves. You've got an individual and everybody else just kind of dissolves into them, right? They represent this whole wife and child kind of thing. In actuality, there is no heroic individual out there on their own. They still need to eat and be clothed and sleep. They're still brought up as children. They're still cared for when they're sick and elderly. So you actually have to be an individual in relation. There's nobody who's completely soluble either. Nobody totally gives up their agency, even if they are conned into giving up a lot of it. So rather than being this myth of the separative self or this myth of the soluble self, we have to realize that everybody is an individual, but also created by the causes and conditions and circumstances of our life and our continuing interactions with other people. Regarding methodology, economics, for example, we prioritize mental choice, and we may think that any other thing is neglecting agency. There was somebody who once quipped, economics is all about how people make choices and sociology about how they have no choices to make. Okay, so when you get over into social and physical stuff, it can be pretty easy to forget about agency. But if you go over to the mental choice side and you forget about bodily experience and you forget about social interactions, you neglect people's needs. You neglect people's needs for food, clothing, shelter, for the ability to have a homeland they can stay in, not be made into refugees, for the ability to have a family that they can belong to, okay? These kinds of things. So if we're really going to do economics, we have to take into account both people's agency and their bodily and social experiences. So this would be more about humans. If we take in these phenomena of individuality and relationship, choice and agency and embodiment and being embedded in societies. What about the fact that economics is being done by humans? We put very high value in economics on being precise and elegant. Okay, again, math and statistics can give you precise sounding answers. Answers that come out at the numbers at the bottom of the page. The problem with that, as I said, it might not really be about anything in the economy at all. Beautiful theorem and proof, totally unrealistic, doesn't relate to anything. So we tend to look down on sociologists and other people as being imprecise and vague. But really good verbal and qualitative research is not just imprecise and vague, it's rich and realistic. So is it possible to use these precise and elegant tools and our tools that could give us richness and realism to complement each other? Can we come up with good sound theories that aren't just vague, but also just aren't entirely out there and totally unrealistic, rated to the world? So if imprecision and messiness are not things to aim for, but precision is our only goal, we'll probably end up with thin and unrealistic. Now, the last part of this, so what is economics about? What do we want to get from good economics? What characterizes good methodology? I said careful influence and openness to new evidence, evaluation by larger communities. We are social beings as humans. When we say by humans, it means that knowledge making is a profoundly social activity, and expanded communities are required for reliability. Give you a little hint of where I'm going with this later on. This has already created huge controversies in fields like psychology and education, little bits of controversy in economics. The question of replicability of studies, that it can be really hard. And there's a lot of publication bias, so only certain things get published. So that whole process of the social structure of science can cause diversions from that sort of reliable knowledge we want to get. And there has to be more social checks and balances on knowledge to make sure that our knowledge is reliable. So now I'm going to go into two cases. The first one is about knowledge making requiring social critique. And the second one will be about just one quick example of where better economics is badly needed in the world, and the neglect of ethics has had a very great cost. So why does knowledge making require social critique? And I already just alluded to this about a minute ago. We humans have confirmation bias. We tend to perceive and seek out information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs and avoid information that would challenge them. There's a great little psychology experience you can find online, but I can't remember what you search under for right now. It's observational bias or something like that. But yeah, if we're told to do a certain task, we tend to tune out everything else going on. If we expect to see something, we will tend to see that and not the evidence that goes against it. And this is well known. It happens among scientists. I actually saw one study that the more objective people think they are, the more they fall into this. So the more alert you are that you may suffer from confirmation bias, the more you may be able to find some ways of protecting against it. And then publication bias, like I said, the social nature of knowledge. Whether or not a study gets published depends on what it finds. And in particular, studies with statistically significant results are more likely to be published. So this means there's a whole lot of research that's never known about. Now, why does this make social knowledge making requiring social critique? I got very curious. It's a while ago now, probably 15 years ago or something, that I got into, probably about the time this stuff was coming out. I got interested in this growing literature, which unfortunately in many ways is still growing across the same lines, that makes this bold statement claim women are more risk averse than men. I got a big review article in the Journal of Economic Literature, judgment and decision making. And a lot of this is very essentializing, like, women are one way, men are the other. Girls will be girls. Okay. Will women be women? Strong evidence of gender differences in risk taking. And I decided, it's also about cooperation and competition, other fields where they've come up with the same results using the same methods. I decided to just narrow down on risk to keep my research project in line. And I remember hearing a radio show one time, the Freakonomics radio show, where somebody who in this research was asked about the research showing categorical differences between men and women. And both the person asking the question and the researcher just went on to talk about their research, that this is categorical differences. Women are one way, men are the other. Our research shows it. So I went on to take a look at this. And when on this slide, the idea of categorical difference is 100% of women are one way, 100% of men are the other. So for example, one of these articles argued that women investors should be paired with women investment advisors because they have the same management style, and men should just go with men. So really, black and white, two categories. But I found that in the literature, particularly used in psychology and education, hasn't gotten into economics enough. There is a way of looking at the substantive size of a difference. We tend to look in economics at statistical significance. And this has gotten us into a lot of trouble, as the people looking into replications and stuff have discovered. But I looked at, is there a way to look at substantive difference? And there's a good way in the literature. I won't go into all the formulas and stuff for it. This is a measure called Cohen's d. And if you think, for example, of men's and women's height in the graph sort of in the middle of the slide, there's X bar M is the average male height, X bar F is the average female height. Those are the distributions. A lot of men around average, a few men really tall, really short. Same for women. There's a distribution around each of these. It turns out if you look at the distribution of men's and women's heights, standard deviation by appropriately weighting the standard deviation. So assuming these two distributions have the same standard deviation, it's 2.6 of those standard deviations is the difference between the two. Together. In the second one, D equals something which I can't see because of the Zoom screen here, 0.36. So, there's about a third of a standard deviation in between the two. So the means can be different. And statistical significance is, in these cases, mostly a matter of sample size. You get a big enough sample, you can find even the tiniest substantive difference, right? So you could find a difference as small as D equal 0.36, and it could still be statistically significant, right? But is that a categorical difference? Are women, women one place and men the other? Or could there be overlap, right? So economists have tended to talk about men's and women's differences in risk-taking as though they're categorical. And I went back and found a bunch of studies and did a meta-analysis and got back to their data or their results, and where I could, calculated this D value and also something called an index of similarity, which is about the degree of overlap when that can be measured. So here's the D results I got, and it's small type, but it's basically just the overall idea that you want to see. Cohen's D measures there are and each of these studies often had included, there's more than one result, because often they had they used 2 or 3 different samples, 2 or 3 different survey questions. A lot of these for risk analysis used behavioral economic style laboratory studies with lotteries. A few of them used surveys, a few of them used like real world stock market data or game show data or something like that. So that's where this data came from. A lot of them, like I said, had different samples or different questions, so they may have a variety of results. I start with sort of the lowest here. Some of the studies find women take more risks than men. That's what a negative sign means. A lot of studies had entirely non-significant, statistically significant. NSS means not statistically significant. Had either entirely or some not statistically significant results. And then the ones that have only statistically significant results, which again might not be everything that they found, right? Because they're only going to report the ones that look strongest. We get a lot of values, 0.1, 0.32 to 0.55. There's one of these that goes above 1. But for the most part, which of these graphs are the D values closest to? It's not the top one. It's not the middle one. It's the bottom one. Men's and women's distributions have a small difference on average. What does it say if you compare an individual man to an individual woman? Basically nothing. You're drawing from distributions that are almost exactly the same. And if you want more quantification of that, I have that in my articles in my book on this, but I'm not going to go too much further on that. So that result, women are more risk averse than men, categorical difference. You should, treat people differently based on their sex when it comes to risk. That's all false. It was not far from objective result, far from a reliable result. All these people feeling like they're doing rigorous economic research because they're using statistics, didn't use the statistics correctly. Okay, interpreted statistical significance as something else, came out with this false idea. And why did they get away with that for so long? Because there wasn't anybody going back and saying, hey, statistical significance and substantive significance are different. It might be a woman that goes back and does the meta-analysis and says, I think there might be some stereotyping going on behind here. Also some confirmation bias. If you did one of these studies and the women took a lot more risks than men, that you might not think that's so publishable. If you hold a stereotype that men are the risk takers, and if you think the reviewers and editors are going to hold a stereotype that men are the risk takers, you might think I must have made a mistake somewhere. So into the file drawer that paper goes, right? So a lot of things that found no statistical significance. It's funny, these ones that had none still made a big deal out of it. Or find statistical significance in the wrong direction. Go in the file drawer, you never see them. However, I also found a very clever way of taking a peek in that file drawer. And I'll try to do it quickly with 2 slides, again, not get into the technical details. But these people, Stanley and a Greek name I'm afraid I can't pronounce, their article talks about this thing called a funnel diagram. And this comes from basic statistical theory. We talk about sampling distributions, and what we have on the horizontal axis here is something that we're trying to estimate, some parameter we're trying to get. Every dot is a different study providing an estimate of that parameter. Precision here measures the precision of the study, which is largely a function of the sample size. So we know that the more observations you have, the more precise your estimates are going to get. And the less information you have, the more you're going to get some wild variation. And that's what, it looks like an upside down funnel. This particular one was a meta-analysis of union productivity partial correlations. And it turns out there's people on both sides of that argument. Some people want to argue that unions increase productivity. Others want to argue that unions decrease productivity. So either way, it's publishable, right? So positive and negative signs there. The vertical line is at 0. You can say that they move together or they move differently. Both can get published. What about risk-taking and gender? I've got actually 3 slides on this, but I'll just show you one. The most precise estimates of Cohen's D I could find came out to about 0.13, I think. I can't show them on this graph because they came from surveys with thousands of responses. But you can imagine the true parameter value, as close as we can estimate it, being down about 0.13 on this graph. And the 3 highest ones in this graph are also down in that range. Is there a nice even symmetric reverse funnel here? Or does it look a little bit more filled in on the men take more risk side? What we're seeing in that emptiness on the left is what's in the file drawers. Okay, at the left, and those ones that say downplayed are generally not statistically significant, because the less precise you get, the less likely you are to get statistical significance. The other ones are the ones that are statistically significant. You have to be further out, either this way or this way, to get statistical significance. So there is, I think, quite clearly confirmation bias running with a result because it fits what you think, rather than actually looking at what the empirical results mean, and publication bias in this field. And these people played with all the usual, rules. They gathered data, they did statistical analysis, they checked their p-values, et cetera, and they still came up with these crazy results and interpretations. So that was my first case. Why we need social feedback. Why I hope if you read this literature, you also read my meta-analysis to find out why you shouldn't believe all of those titles. My second case is about how economists have done great damage by ignoring ethics. Aren't we just neutral scientists? Can't we leave all that decision-making up to the policymakers, et cetera, et cetera? Sina and I were talking before this talk started. I think that's basically, they may believe it, but it's basically a ruse for people in power to keep power, because you don't want to investigate what has given you privilege, what has made you available, possible to get this kind of education, this kind of position, do this kind of research. If you really looked into these values, you might find some disturbing stuff, and maybe you didn't earn everything you thought you earned. So again, economics from the time of Mill at least has been saying that economics is about individual actors acting in their self-interest, generally in a competitive way. We idealize competitive markets, and we push to the side anything about relatedness, anything about other interest. Are we concerned, even about our families? Might we actually have some concerns for humanity, for people even further away from us? Might we even have some concerns for the survival of other species? And do we cooperate? And to cooperate not only, as Sen pointed out, we not only cooperate in families, we also compete. And as many people who study business point out, we not only compete in business, we also cooperate. So these things go together. But economics has pushed all of that cooperation, non-self-interest to the side. So some people have, I think, particularly some radicals and philosophers have gone off the wrong track by believing what economists say about behavior, in markets and commerce. And if they don't like those, if they do like those results, they're University of Chicago economists, okay? If they don't like something about the results, they may suggest switching. We need to create a new economy based entirely on community and gift giving and cooperation. I don't think it would work. It's kind of a nice utopia, but whatever. Or like some, very notable philosophers, they propose limits to markets. Okay, individuality, self-interest, competition are fine if you're selling umbrellas, but if you're providing healthcare, that better be state provided, because we know everybody is just after the last buck in commerce. Well, where did that idea that everybody is just after the last buck in commerce come about? It was these folks. Economy is a machine. Everybody is out for their own, to build their own wealth. We can prove it with calculus, so we're going to just stick to this because it makes it look like scientists. Some people have called this physics envy. Want to be able to use that calculus all the time, feel like scientists. And then I have to add one more onto this to make a very specific example. Let's jump to 1976. Well, not only do firms try to find that top of the profit maximization line, that was the neoclassical edition. Firms are entities that maximize profits. Instead of firms are places that create jobs, that create products, that satisfy customers or don't, that are social organizations where there's the usual sorts of battling for status. They're cooperative organizations where nobody can learn a job unless somebody else teaches them, et cetera. Instead of looking at the full dimension of what a firm is, a firm got reduced to that high point on the profit function. But then there came this question, well, if chief executive officers, if CEOs are also entirely self-interested, how can we be sure they're going to manage the company to maximize profits? Maybe we better align their incentives with those of the shareholders by making sure that they share in the profits. So we'll give them stock options as their bonuses and rewards in order to incentivize them to do what the shareholders want. Funny, I guess it was a very old-fashioned idea that if you pay people a lot of money, they'll be responsible and do their job. We lost that idea of humanity somewhere. We lost the idea of the statesperson or the business leader and turned those into the politician and the self-interested CEO. So with that, and then the graph, of course, this is the US income distribution. Top 1%, funnily enough, right about, not too long after 1976, it had been tracking along, getting a share that was pretty steady. After we start incentivizing top corporate leaders, their bonuses are tied to profits, their income, top 1%, takes off, everybody else stagnates. And even business leaders are saying, a lot of business leaders are saying there's something wrong with this, because obviously the CEOs are not they don't need to maximize the health of the business over the long term. They just need to maximize profits until they can take their money and run. So creates a lot of problems all around. So I say a moral failure, particularly because of the neglect of what's going on there with the bottom percentiles, but also just a failure to provide survival and flourishing and provide a kind of society in which power is not so concentrated that we all end up doing the bidding of only the super rich. So what would be a better way? Studying the actual history and behavior of firms and individuals? Oh no, we can't just start from Mill's assumptions. That assumption about maximizing behavior is a dogma. It never came, had no origination in actual study. Realizing that purely opportunistic, everybody out for themselves, it's no good in families and communities. It's also no good in companies, economies, and certainly doing no good for societies or the environment. And we need to revive, it's all based on that broader definition of economics. Economics should be about survival and flourishing. So I think we need all hands on deck to work towards that. And my conclusion, I just have some images here because sometimes people get lost in all the words. But mainstream economics, what is economics is all of this. If you Google economics on the web, you'll get things like this, either stock market graphs or coins. If you Google care, like care for people, care for humanity, care for the environment, you Google the word care and you get a picture like this. Hard to reconcile the two. Okay, one is very masculine and quantitative, the other one very feminine and white and middle class. And I don't know why you would take a picture on a white background if you've ever actually had a real baby. So I've tried to come up with some images. One of them is I've got an article about husbandry. Husbandry is about masculine responsibility for care. This is a sheep farmer. Sheep farming is, in this case, also a masculine activity. It's a productive activity. Do you have to care for the feeding and health? Do you have to care for the environment and make sure that there's enough grass in the meadows? You have to bring these things together. And I decided, I chose that one because I don't think, if you look back at this graph, men have to become women to care. I don't think that's true. Men can care in whatever ways seem to be appropriate. And what about for women? Is care only about white mothers and babies and this idealized background? This was a poster that of Michelle Obama in a iconographic World War II, yes, we can poster. We need powerful care. Care is not just about tending your own baby, but it's also for fighting for enough funds for education, fighting for enough funds for health. Men and women can do both the sheep farming, both the running of companies, both the diligent husbandry of business and productive activities, and both men and women need to show their care with some power. And like I said, I thought I'd run about an hour. Those are just a couple of the references that I worked from, and that's just about what I did. So nobody interrupted me. I just kept on talking. I will stop the share here and hopefully we'll have some discussion. My favorite part.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julia, for this very wonderful talk. Yes, no, I think everything was perfectly clear. That's why people did not interrupt you. So it was very nice listening to the talk. I am going to ask you maybe, shall I? Yeah, I mean, I would just ask one question at the very beginning. After that, I would invite others also to ask their questions. And then if you have time, I would also ask other questions. So my first question would be, I couldn't completely understand what is your position on the masculine-feminine distinction. Do you think that the distinction holds? What is its status?
I think it's that. I think that the distinction is probably not something, I mean, the fact that a lot of students are identifying as non-binary and that kind of thing shows that people are, at least some people are getting more playful with this, right? I don't know that we're ever going to get beyond it, but the dangers really come when we associate masculinity and femininity with people. Women are feminine, men are masculine. All the psychology shows that we're actually quite composites. If you actually saw somebody that fit all those stereotypes of one or the other, they would be a freak. There are men in the arts, there are women who do math, there are, nobody follows the stereotypes exactly, but they still exist as these kinds of images and these cognitive organizers. And the stuff I read in psychology suggests that this hits in pretty early, around age 2 or 3. young children notice that there are different bodily forms and different voice pitches and stuff in their life and start to map things onto that. So the idea of ever becoming a completely gender-free society, I don't think it's probably going to happen, but we can get a lot more playful and a lot less tied to it. I like to think of it as, I don't know if you had the same game in France or elsewhere, but we had a game called red light, green light when I was a kid. And you have a bunch of kids line up and you have somebody on the other side of like a field and they yell red light, green light, and you can run on the green light and you have to stop on the red, right? That's great when you're a kid, red light, green light, men, women, and most kids will go through some period around 3 where they will be pretty exaggerated, in their gender associations. But then we can grow up. Then we can realize that there are also yellow lights. There are also flashing lights. Even at one time I used in a talk, somebody put together a picture of a traffic signal that had a whole rainbow of lights. Okay, we can play around with that. We don't have to stick with our childish red light, green light limitations. Even though, it is still good to remember that red means stop and green means go if you're going to go out and drive, basic instruction. Yeah. I don't know if that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it does clarify. Absolutely. Maybe one other rapid question regarding the penultimate slide, maybe when you called for a sort of broader definition of economics, but sometimes I get the impression that this broadening by supposedly, at least in, let's say, in neoclassical economics, by supposedly going beyond the quest for material prosperity and including this supposedly broader notion of preferences, which according to Robbins is no longer materialistic and so on and so forth. This basically led, for example, to the disappearance of the very distinction, for example, between basic needs and other, at least Smith says that, for example, food is the true wealth of the world, right? At least in this, so to speak, more materialistic definition. Whereas sometimes I get the impression that the danger of broadening is that what you said, that the bodily part could get completely overlooked in favor of, let's say, supposedly more novel or more individualistic preferences. So do we really need a broadening, or rather maybe even
we need a broadening of the definition and methods, not a broadening of the application of the same old methods. What I think a lot of those people who broadened in that sense, it was says, okay, we've got this rational choice model. And like Becker's treatise on the family. Okay, we've been using this to analyze markets. I'm going to use it to take, look at the family or something like that. Or some behavioral economists are thinking they can reinvent psychology, like they're pretty late to the field. Anyway, but the broadening I'm talking about is the definition about survival and flourishing. What was that first one of taking one method and then applying it everywhere? Essentially, you've got a hammer and you're going to make everything into a nail, whether it is or not, right? You've got a hammer and you're going to bang on it like it's a nail, whether it's a family, whether it's a community, whether it's, philanthropic giving or whatever. You're still going to assume self-interest, individual behavior, et cetera. And that just distorts things. You try to build a house with just a hammer and you're going to be in a lot of trouble. You also need a drill and you also need some other things. The hammer's not going to get you everywhere. So the definition I want is that, that's survival and flourishing. How do we organize things for survival and flourishing? I have some other stuff. Right? I talked about bigger questions and broader toolbox, that we really need to be looking at the big questions like survival, like flourishing, like, climate change, like inequality, continuing poverty, these kinds of things. We need to look at the big questions. And we need to expand our toolbox as well. That little rational choice, formal modeling model is not going to give us the reliable kinds of knowledge that we need. So we need to address the big questions, not just the little ones, and broaden our tools.
So the broadening is mainly about the instruments, the tools, and the methods.
It's about the methods, but it's also to the survival and flourishing. I mean, this is the broadening. To the extent that people have defined economics around markets, it's entirely ignored, women's history of household production. or disproportionate contributions to household production. Or we're talking about survival and flourishing. Provision of care to young children is a big contributor to it. And if we just, focus on markets, then we lose all of that. So it is broadening in that sense of all of the things. And, we also don't study things like inheritance, right? Which is the way a lot of people don't get their sustenance in the, not a lot of people, unfortunately, very few people, but there's a few but important group of people that don't work for wage labor, but inherit their money. And that's their flourishing. Okay. But we don't look at that as economists. So looking more at these non-market transfers of, care, human capital, but we don't need to be that economistic about it when we look at, broader things. So there is some broadening of the areas we're looking at as well, but they're all still about the survival and flourishing, not just about the, subjective mental processes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Very clear. Thank you very much. It's very helpful. That's your answer. Yes, please, Ortrud, the floor is yours for your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this talk. Very, very, very clear talk. I got two questions. One is I think you already said that there is some broadening taking place. So that would be simply, is it this what you've said just now, that economics is at the moment already broadening in some ways? And the second question is so about the role of female economists in this process. Do you think there is a special role for women or do you think it doesn't matter? So perhaps simply because women very often are still in this. I think we often have to deal with these expectations about we are the one who care for others and all this. So maybe this would be one reason to think that that female economists will make some change, and I would like to hear your view on this.
Yeah, the first one is economics broadening, maybe a little and not always in good ways. Like I said, my meta-analysis of the risk studies, was really, it's mostly in behavioral economics, and they're trying to broaden and, claim some of the psychology territory, for economics, but often with much narrower models and much naivete, and no benefit from the kinds of research. Or like, Becker's treatise on the family was a broadening into this other area, but with, really a very inadequate set of tools. There's some hope for, I've been saying rational choice model as an abbreviation. So people would say, oh, well, behavioral economics has shown blah, 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 blah. But as long as it stays still with, the narrow methodology, the narrow focus, and forgetting about social feedback, which can show that the results are invalid, it's not really broadening enough. In terms of women economists, first of all, there's a methodological aspect to having diverse groups. I think it's not only nice to have diversity by gender, race, socioeconomic, and everything else in a field, but it helps show where the biases are. There's a saying that fish don't notice that they're swimming in water. That describes very well what I felt like going to graduate school. The men didn't realize they were swimming in a masculine environment. The 4 women in my class of 35 noticed that we were swimming in a very masculine environment, not only by the men around us, but the sorts of topics and the sorts of, just everything going on had that slant to it. So the insight into the biases may come from women economists, may also come from, non-Western economists, and, every other kind of diversity we have there is, it shows this up. And then it is not true that, women fit a stereotype. Whenever I think of people who say, well, aren't women more cooperative? I think, think of Margaret Thatcher, Golden My Year, really? Are women always more cooperative? On the other hand, think of that, really nice guy, So it's not that there are stereotypes here, but because of the way our societies are structured, we do get expected to take on a lot more care work, a lot more housework, and then, of course, we have the pregnancies and childbirth, and some people feel like, the next 18 years then is, the same part of that. So when it comes to the interest in studying things like childcare or the interest in doing policy, thinking of childcare really as an infrastructure. We finally got that in the Biden administration one of their first bills, that due to a feminist economist, Heather Boushey, being in the administration, I'm sure. You need a road to get to work? Great. You need childcare to get to work? Yeah, that's also infrastructure, just as much as a road or a bridge. But that's not a perspective that's there if you haven't been, had that expectation that you're going to take care of it privately on your own. No public subsidy or help needed.
Thank you so much. There is a question in the chat. Emmanuel Petit, do you want to ask the question orally as well, or shall I read it out loud?
I'm reading it myself now.
Okay, so for others, you can also see the question in the chat.
Is my approach to science similar to that of non-dual conception of pragmatist philosophy? It is similar, yes. In fact, I did a lot of studying of pragmatist philosophy in the what are called the old institutionalist economists, who had a lot in common with the pragmatists. They weren't so interested in developing an elegant theory as solving some real world problems. And the pragmatist approach tends to get dissed from people both on kind of the political right and the left. It was really the sorts of compromises we came to in the US during the progressive era were basically put forward by pragmatists. Anyway, I won't go into the political side too much, because actually you asked about emotion and body and everything else. I mean, I do think that the masculine feminine dichotomy is one of the ways that this has been mapped onto societies and mapped onto our consciousness in such a way that we sometimes aren't even aware of the fact that we're making those unhealthy dualisms that are also pointed out in pragmatist philosophy. But if you have more to that question, please do speak up. I conclude.
Thank you so much. There is a question from Anne. Anne, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that talk. It's really interesting. My question is kind of touching on what you said at the end. It seemed like, I definitely agree and adopt in my own work the idea that, individuals aren't necessarily rational. That's just like very obvious from day-to-day life, talking to people and seeing how people make decisions. But it seemed like towards the end, you were saying also that maybe we should challenge the idea that firms are only profit maximizers. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that, because, I'm a graduate student, I go to a heterodox program. And I feel like, the way we think about, there's not a lot of talk about like the political economy of firms, I feel like, even in heterodox programs. But when we do think about, when we do talk about like capitalists, we usually tend to talk about them as very focused on profit. Whereas if you look at this, like in the neoliberal or in the, mainstream literature, there is this new literature on like corporate social responsibility that seems to suggest, corporations, care about certain topics and they're willing to do stuff about it. So yeah, I'm just wondering your perspective on like, should we think of firms as mainly driven by profit? If it's not mainly profit, what other type of things should we, like, what are firms considering when they're making their decisions?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I'm actually I edit the economics section of the Journal of Business Ethics because I feel strongly about this. And this is a lot of what my book, Economics for Humans, is about. The problem is that both the far right and the far left have accepted this idea of this mechanical firm profits, and neither of them questions it, and that creates this, this big debate. A lot of the people actually in, studying businesses, like I say, if you actually go out and study what businesses do, I mean, a lot of them don't maximize anything. They're total messes, right? I mean, they're human organizations, so they may or may not be effective in whatever goals they go towards. And then when you look at what goals they go towards, making a profit is among the goals. They want to give some, return to their shareholders. But if you've ever worked for a nonprofit, you have to meet your payroll too. You have to make your costs and revenues balance somehow, right? So it's not like, and a business has to make, a little bit extra to give some return to its shareholders, but it's not necessarily all running after that. There's a lot of work on, visionary companies, conscious capitalism, business ethics, corporate social responsibility, these kinds of things that some of it gets kind of woo-woo and idealistic, but a lot of it is about the fact that firms are human, social organizations. And just as, a business leader who's not just a, profit maximizing CEO might do a good job for the company without being incentivized by stock options, they might also be a grandparent who wants the world to be a decent place for their, children and grandchildren to grow up in. And that can also affect what they do. And of course, people inside the firm, may be more able to make, more progressive policies, the more there's also activity outside the firm pressing them towards that. And the more there is government action, creating standards for all firms to follow so they don't have to lose profits because other people are undercutting their costs. But we should be able to look at firms more as a center of, that can have some creative and innovative solutions for things like climate crisis, for things like inequality. I don't think we have to dismiss them as evil. I use the phrase all hands on deck, because I think we can't just have little utopian local communities doing this and leave out everything else. We really need to harness the energy of all of this and get it away from this idea that you have to be selfish in your economic life. Because I think a lot of people don't want to be, they don't want to work for companies that are that way. They'll actually, there's, human resources research on, people perform their jobs better when they feel like they are valued and they feel like they're making a valuable project than when they're, just working for a wage was an economics invention. So I forget exactly where I was going with this, but that's
no, that's
spiel on that.
Very interesting. Yeah, thank you. No, I think that's very interesting. I was just going to say that, like I agree technically with this idea of like all hands on deck, especially addressing climate change and things like that. But at the same time, it does seem like, we can't really rely on firms to like it does seem like the profit motive does prevent firms from fully being able to come up with these creative solutions to address, or maybe do so sufficiently enough to address the problem.
Yeah, I think some are. I think some of the others would be, which is why there's still, like I said, big room for citizen movement and consumer boycotts and everything else to give the signals, and a lot of space for governments to create regulations and other things that will help firms make a profit and do well for their societies and economy. But I mean, think about, the US under the previous administration, which was more progressive on climate, the government or the corporations? Actually, there's a whole band of corporations that got together and put together a New York Times ad about, we need some, realistic climate legislation now. And the Trump administration was completely deaf to it. So all these people around saying, well, isn't that really the role of the state, the beneficent state that always knows what people want and is always going to do the public good? Well, maybe the state doesn't always do the public good. Maybe families are not always peaceful and there's domestic violence. Maybe firms can sometimes be really cutthroat and nasty. And maybe there's potential for all of these areas of life to contribute to something that's better. So I don't see any of these realms as black or white. I think you need to judge by what they actually do.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe just before giving the floor to Emmanuel, maybe very, very briefly, but I would only say that it seems to me that, for example, at least let's say in wealthier, so to speak, countries, for example, I mean, I was wondering, but maybe you could answer to that question after answering Emmanuel's question, in the sense of, do you think there is any link between the question of property relationships and the attitude towards property and the feminine masculine worldview, in the sense that, for example, let's say at least in richer countries, I tend to think that at least at the government level, we have far more opening of the field to women, whereas when it comes to bigger companies, they remain utterly male dominated things, in the sense that, for example, when I looked last time, I looked at the Fortune 500 list, there were very few women, right, among the richest, wealthiest people on earth, at least people whose wealth is being counted, right? Whereas we have this, you know, we have women head of state and so on and so forth. In that sense, I think, yeah.
I mean, there too, it's a mixed bag. I mean, we have yet to have a woman president of the U.S. You know, there's certainly, it's not that that having, you know, things at a more social or political level is necessarily better. And there's one of the things I learned, you know, looking into more of kind of the management and business side of things, is one problem that a lot of multinational companies face is that the companies that they operate in may be much less progressive on things like women's rights than their company is. So they have, say, you know, a female director of some kind who has to go do business in Kuwait, and she has to take her male assistant with her to do the talking for her, right? Because she is not allowed, you know, she can't speak up in this environment. So, you know, where are they progressive? Where are they less progressive? Again, I think it's to paint all of them, you know, all of the companies with a single brush, I think, distorts it, just as to, you know, paint all states or communities or families and say that they're all doing the same thing. I don't know if did that get to your question?
Yes, but it was mainly about the question of basically the attitude towards property and the ownership of property, in the sense that, do you think there is something we can also try to trace the way that property is understood, the ownership of property? Is that something that is related to the male sort of worldview that you were trying to criticize?
I think it's related to this individualized worldview, that, you know, if the individual owns property, and from there they can exclude everybody else. So I'm going to be this little autonomous person on my piece of land, right? And then on the other side, we have, you know, community ownership, we have the commons, that kind of thing. And the standard, you know, mainstream economics story about that is there should be the tragedy of the commons. The commons will get overused, et cetera. Elinor Ostrom's work, for, you know, which she got the Nobel, was showing that, you know, that's not the case. People can actually work these things out. You know, economies are social organizations, and people can figure out how to, you know, hold some things in common and not exploit them. So in that, and, you know, maybe it's not a coincidence that Elinor Ostrom was also, I think, the only woman to win a Nobel laureate prize at
her time. Yeah, after that, another woman won the prize, but at her time, I think she was the first. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and she was, you know, she's a political scientist. You know, she was not locked into the mainstream economics box, but had done a lot of work on this issue, that, you know, on these ways of dealing with the commons that don't appear in mainstream economics.
Thank you so much. Emmanuel Picavet, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentations. I'm not in ideal conditions, but I'd like to ask, in your opinion, which sources can be relied on to test hypotheses about the masculine and the feminine in the kind of culture which has surrounded modern economics? Because the meaning of the notions is not absolutely obvious. And should we turn, for example, to novels? For example, the novels of Balzac are replete with references to the true categories, feminine and masculine, in order to characterize separate types of mind. For example, some male characters are said to be feminine and so on, or maybe to medical writings, as some researchers in France would have it, for example, Hélène Rouche or Julie Mazalet-Glabaste, or to moralistic writings or something else. So my question is about the empirical basis for ideas or theses or hypotheses about what is masculine and what is feminine.
I'm not quite, let me give a couple stabs at an answer and see if they meet your question. In terms of empirical research about people's associations of things with these concepts of masculinity and femininity, there's a great deal of research in cognitive psychology. Sandra Bem did a number of these things, although hers was more related to, how much people identify with these different things rather than how they categorize them. I have some references in some of my work, but I can't pull up the names offhand. But
so it's more to do with.
Like, I remember one of the studies was giving people. So, you might just mute yourself while I'm speaking, and then you can come back on. But giving people lists of things to memorize, like 7 items or 10 items or something like that. People could remember them better if they were all like masculine items, like dog, shotgun, something like that, versus purse, whatever. If they're all masculine or all feminine, rather than if they were neutral, which seems to suggest that we are somehow cognitively more able to bring these things together. There's been studies done with what's called the implicit attitude test, which is about how quickly you can make associations of a concept with a word. If it's a stereotyped word, if you have to match masculine and you have to match. It's hard to explain without spending 10 minutes in it, but there's a number of psychological studies about how we automatically make these stereotypic associations. Actually, I have a slide in one of my other presentations that shows a little MRI image. We use different parts of our brains to associate a woman and math than to associate a woman and a baby. Because the woman and baby one is easier for us, the woman and math one takes a little bit more work. And it actually can be found with how fast you can fit a key to make those associations. Now, I don't know if that's what you were looking for. In terms of, masculine and feminine within the fields, people don't start out these days saying, I'm writing a masculine article. But if you go back in history of science, Francis Bacon said, our goal is to raise a masculine philosophy, whereby the mind of man may be enlightened by certain truths or something like that. I don't think I got the last couple of words right, but it was very clearly, in their minds that their image of masculinity was tied in with the images of rigorous science. And if you ever want, it takes a little bit of linguistic analysis, but I don't think it's, over too many people's heads, even if you haven't done any. I'm comparing the statement of purpose of the Econometric Society with a statement of purpose of the American Sociological Association. Actually, it was American Sociological Society originally, so it had a bad acronym, and they changed it later. But if you read their statements of purpose, Econometrica is, we want to raise a, what did they say? But we want to raise a field that's going to be penetrated by the rigorous thinking in the physical science and dominate. It's got the words penetrated and dominated in it. Anyway, it's kind of a hoot. It's on the back cover, inside the back cover of every Econometrica. You read the one of the ASA, and the ASA was founded largely by men, if you look at who attended that conference. But it's clearly got this more feminine side, if you think of those divisions of knowledge. They took on what one historian, Mara Ferner, calls the leftovers. They got crime, they got the family, politics and economy got, over here, and they got these other things that are kind of considered softer. And they say basically, we're going to join together not to try to, compete with anybody else for their fields, but we're just going to come up with some results and offer them to see if they stand up. Now, are there gender connotations to those ways of expressing oneself? I would say very clearly, we're going to penetrate and dominate. We're just going to offer up some stuff. There are ways of speaking, ways of writing that reflect this, that I think reflect these kinds of divisions in the sciences and social sciences.
Okay, thank you.
I get the impression that I think maybe what Manuel was also trying to say is that in the sense that there are so many people nowadays who, as soon as we talk about women and men, they tend to think that there is some essentializing going on.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
how can we retain the distinction? What are the empirical foundations of the distinctions without this leading to any essentialization of certain things as feminine essentially or masculine essentially? I think that was maybe part of the intention of the question.
Yeah, that essentializing. Actually, I would say that earlier question about businesses, we've essentialized firms as profit maximizers. Maybe they aren't. If we essentialize women as feminine and essentialize men as masculine, we're making the same thing. We're putting the same stuff together. I mean, like I said, in my talk, I started out talking about this cognitive gender. And then I talk about all the things it's not. It's not about men think one way, women think the other. It's not about this. It's not about that. It's not about that. But it does seem to be a way that we organize our brains. At least most of us. Some people have no gender association, apparently, even with dogs and cats. But there is, it's tricky because like I said, I think it's good to remember that red means stop and green means go. And I think, social movements based on, women have been more exploited in this realm and men have been more privileged, still need to use that. But does that mean we have to limit our thinking to that and think that, men are always men, women are always women, there's no trans people, there's no non-binary, et cetera. So it's a matter of sophistication and where you're applying it. For some political, say, movements, men and women is a good, a good distinction to make. And for other things, for judging any individual's character, it's terrible.
Very interesting. Yes, very, very, very interesting what you said. Thank you. There is a comment by I apologize if I pronounce your first name incorrectly. Jaim Park. Do you want to speak? Do you want to say what you have written? If you want, the floor is yours. You can. Oh, you have no access to your microphone. Okay.
Yeah, it's so PhD candidate standard cutting care work and degrowth. Arguments to expand the care economy and reduce the economy so the care work is appropriately valued, and also degender the domain of care work. Yes, and that's good stuff. I've done some work in ecological as well as feminist economics. I don't use the label ecofeminist because sometimes that has been adopted by people who think that women really are closer to nature and have a more natural, and I think that is essentializing. But certainly the way both women's care work and the environment has been treated in economics is very similar. Women are assumed to just provide care work freely forever. The environment's just assumed to provide, fuel and resources, freely forever. And so they've been, both been exploited. And there are links and there are people working on both feminist and ecological topics. And sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. There have been some people, for example, arguing for reduced work weeks in the form of fewer days of work, which cuts down on transportation and the rest of that, doesn't necessarily do so much for covering care of young children. So, are there ways, in some areas, maybe cutting down the days of work works better. In some, but it may also be that cutting down the hours of work so that, work is more just in the hours kids are in school could make it more possible for men and women to be carers. So if you really have to kind of keep both priorities in mind when you're thinking about how to make these kind of social changes. And of course, right now, the economy is stacked against both the environment and women. So work is helpful. I hope that got to the question. It's basically just a yes. Yeah. Oh, here's the other one.
I think it is being said that, yes, now some ecofeminists basically, they have more a sort of Marxist or deconstructivist attitude, which leads them to defend ecofeminism without necessarily thinking of any link between feminism, that's a femininity and nature. That sort of thing, it seems to me.
I
But
do have to say, just, as long as you brought up Marxism and deconstruction, Sina and I were talking earlier, a lot of people who consider themselves Marxists probably never read Marx, because you think of Marx primarily in terms of fighting for justice. That's not really very much in Marx. Marx tries very hard to not make any value claims and base everything essentially on a mechanical model. I think at one point he actually says he follows Smith in noticing that the economy is this machine that has these forces, all the forces and energies. And so he works out his falling rate of capital and everything else in terms of these forces and energies that are inevitable. He really doesn't talk about justice much at all. And deconstructive, I think a lot of what I, have done follows along the idea of deconstructing gender, deconstructing economics. On the other hand, I'm also a pragmatist at heart. And at the end, I want this to come out, not to just, I remember a deconstructor saying something about endless deferral and play. Fine if you're sitting in your office, but I actually wanted to come out into some things that are good for humans, to come out into some policies and some changes in the way we organize this economy.
Yes.
And as well as a deconstructionist.
Yeah, the very, very interesting remark about, and for Marx, absolutely, I think, yes, when one reads Marx, one sees very clearly that the falling rate of profit is basically his take on capitalism. I mean, he's really doing everything to just deduce this falling rate of profit, and he was very harsh on other socialists of the time who precisely had as a sort of moral critique of capitalism. He wanted his critique to be amoral.
He wanted to be, he wanted to get into that same mindset, as the other folks around.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
Ricardo's got some of that. A lot of them, even though a lot of the classical economists were more concerned with income distribution than neoclassical economics, they also tended to, buy into a lot of that mechanical stuff. Yeah. I mean, not that machine metaphors need not be harmful. They can sometimes be helpful, but when they're hegemonic and you're not allowed to do anything but work with a machine metaphor, that's very bad.
I have another question, but if anyone wants to ask a question or comments, please come forward. Question? No. So I'm going to maybe ask a question about, so what should we do about this whole notion of objectivity? Is that really, is it worthwhile to speak of basically the idea of trying to attain more objectivity, precisely criticizing, let's say, past forms of objectivity as having been not objective at all, which is actually the case in the sense that we have really sold something as objective, which has not been objective at all? Or do you think it is the whole concept as such which should be more or less forsaken for good? Or
well, there is. I mean, I like to start from the end result and work backwards. And the end result, I think we want from research is reliable knowledge, knowledge that's going to help us deal with our life and deal with our world. And that does mean some kind of, systematic informed investigation. And it does mean checking your results against, what other people would get trying to look at the same phenomenon. So it is not just a matter of first thing off the top of my head or my subjective view. It has gone through, vetting and checking against evidence and the rest of this. But in the end, you don't say, this is the truth. You say, this is what we can find, this is the best we know right now. And like I said, if you look at physics or a lot of other fields, they got there a long time ago and they realized that, Newtonian physics is fine for billiard balls, but it doesn't work for planets or inside a molecule. Okay, it's not that it's false. I mean, a lot of people often want to talk about theories as true or false, and they're either useful or not useful. And that, I think that's where we have to put our values, rather than, I think philosophically it's just kind of empty to say, is something, is some particular theory or fact or finding going to be true, forever and always in every dimension. Heck if I know. But I can say that this is the most reliable knowledge we have about this topic right now. And that it's, supported enough to go on.
But so we can also, maybe beyond the usefulness, we can maybe at least say that a theory A is more objective than theory B. For example, I feel like a lot of things in the feminist literature are sincerely far more objective than
I would just use the word reliable. I think the word objective has gotten reliable. Yeah, I would use reliable. Just because it's reliable, because it takes in, a broader span of data, it takes in women's experiences as well as men's experiences. And when you bring in broader, the more information you have, the better your, work is going to be. So in that sense, yes, it is more reliable. But is it perfectly objective? That I think is just, it's just become such a, I think it's become kind of a polluted word, because there are very few results that, everybody in the world who looks at something is always going to agree on forever. Somebody could come along in another generation and find something else. So, was that really? Whatever research we do now is research from our perspective of living in 2023. And so is that objective? No, it's actually from a certain perspective. No matter how diverse we are in other dimensions, we're still living in this place and time. Smith was living in the Industrial Revolution. Machines were a big deal. Yeah.
But don't you think that, for example, certain phenomena, such as, for example, the skepticism regarding climate change, the proliferation of fake news, that sort of thing, also requires
there is judgment involved here. There's a judgment between reliable and not reliable, based in some evidence and totally made up fantasy, and something that can be verified in some sort of way, right? There's plenty of room for value judgments without saying something is true or false, in stark terms. It can, there can be some gradations there, and there can be some, definitely good enough, but not certain knowledge. And that's what we mostly need to aim for. And we need to try to reject the stuff that is, fantasy and often self-serving fantasy. Like I said, like the fantasy that economics is value-free really serves the people who don't want to talk about income distribution, want to talk about where their power and privilege comes from.
Very interesting. Yes, thank you so much. May I ask if you were to give advice to existing scholars, specifically younger ones, about what kind of research they should be doing? What would be your recommendations about the topics that you find more more imperative in terms of priority?
There's both a what really needs doing and what will lead to survival in a career aspects to it. So things that really need doing have to do with things like climate change and inequality and poverty and discrimination and all of that. Now, if someone is a undergraduate or a PhD student, I don't necessarily give them the advice to dive straight into that, using the best methods they can find, no matter what field they're from, because they're in some kind of program, they have some kind of committee. So doing the best you can in your current constraints and looking for ways that, I mean, although, one senior scholar, I can't remember who it was, but they said, as long as you're putting all this work into something, it might as well be something important. Maybe it might as well be something that matters. So try to find something that matters that you can do within your program, even if it's much smaller than what you eventually want to do, right? Some piece that can be analyzed with the tools you've been taught so far, something that'll get by your thesis advisor. I did my dissertation on household equivalent scales. I actually wanted to bring in time costs into that, the cost of care. And it turned out that the actual literature was so bad that I never got to that point. But, I got my theory part, I got my empirical part, I got outgrowth from it, published in Econometrica, fine. I don't think that was any particular huge contribution to the knowledge of humanity or the wisdom of humanity. But, it got me out and it got me a job, right? So in some ways, if you're young, you do have to take this longer view. But don't forget, keep on sticking a pencil in yourself or something to remember what you got in this for in the first place, so that you can work your way back to that and really work on these bigger issues. I wish I could say there's, you should go to graduate schools, 1 through 5, who will all, give you all of the tools you need to face the really important stuff. But I can't. There's individuals here and there and programs here and there that allow some of this, but really depends on a person's abilities and interests and ability to stomach a lot of problem sets.
Thank you. Maybe we have time for one last question if anyone wants to venture and ask it or comment. Okay, somebody is trying. Okay, so Emmanuel Petit is, so you have. Emmanuel, do you want to speak, like read it out loud yourself?
Oh, yeah. What he's saying here is in the chat is entirely, what I've been trying to say is that, we've tended to neglect emotions, and then we include emotions. We only include the ones that seem a little bit more masculine. Men are allowed to be angry, but they're not allowed to be empathetic and caring and grateful and the rest of this. Yeah. And fear. Yeah, actually, fascinating thing on this risk stuff and fear. I wrote a paper called Fearing Fear. Is our economists afraid of fear? And there was a working paper at one time by Colin Kammerer, who's a behavioral economist, who had a title very much like that, about something about fearing fear. But before it got published, the title got changed. I think it was not acceptable to point out that economists might actually fear something. Yeah. That's about all I can say on that. Yeah, it's very incomplete. Yeah. So even when we do look at something that's a little bit over on the feminine side, we tend to only think that the masculine part of that is respectable.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry, I had a problem with my micro, but it's good now. Thank you.
Yeah, and then that's what I was trying to do with those images of husbandry and powerful care, that we don't have to choose one or the other to be caring or to be economic. We should be able to bring this together and actually be whole human beings, even, in market life. We can try.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we can stop it there. If you have final remarks, Judy.
No, that's fine. If somebody has any follow-up stuff, my UMass, I'm retired now, but my UMass Boston email still works, julie.nelson@umb.edu, and get in touch. It's been great fun to be here. I get tired of my talks, but I always enjoy the discussions. So
no, thank you. Your talk was absolutely amazing, and the discussions were very interesting. Thank you so much. Really, your presence.
The slides, if anybody wants the slides for some reason. So you can provide those to folks. Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yes, absolutely. So again, thank you so much. Really, it was absolutely great. It was an immense joy to have you in this seminar. I really hope to have the opportunity to meet you very soon in person. That would be great. Otherwise, maybe at other events. I should again thank you, other than for your participation in the seminar, but also for your amazing work, which is of great help, really, really of great help for all people who work on the question of values, norms, and similar considerations in economics and in social science. So please keep on your amazing work. And again, thank you for everything that you have already done.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm seeing the people in the chat too. So thanks so much. Bye now.
So thank you also to all of you for having participated. It was great seeing you all, and I look forward to seeing you again. Please don't forget that the next session is next week. We will have Wade Hans, who will give a talk on Frank Knight and behavioral economics. It's going to be next week on Friday from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Paris time. See you next week and have an excellent weekend. Goodbye.